This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon. The Enjoyer Project is only 6 months old. We launched on July 3rd, 2024. Now and forevermore, July 3rd is my personal Independence Day, the day I walked away from the media business as usual. After 20 years in print, July 3rd is the day I started podcasting, using my physical face and my physical voice to connect with you, the viewer. And just like the Bible, news was delivered orally long before it was ever written. On my Substack, Watching the Watchdogs, I have a story about Detroit's first town crier. Back then in the early 1800s, it was connected to the Catholic Church, and the crier would deliver the news orally after services. So keep in mind, you just sat through a sermon where God's word was delivered orally in the sermon. So it wasn't very much of a stretch for those same people to hear the news delivered orally right after. It was only when a printing press arrived in Michigan a few years later that our newspaper tradition started. And so in a sense, leaving the world of newspapers and newsletters and doing a podcast is actually a return to the earliest roots of Michigan journalism. From dust we came, and to dust we will return. When you start a new venture, there's the scoreboard everybody can see. Then there's the internal scoreboard. How many viewers? How many listeners? How many clicks? How many followers? That's the scoreboard. Am I doing my best? Am I making an impact? People are hearing me, but are they really listening? That's the internal scoreboard, and only you know the score on that one. And it can have remarkably little to do with the scoreboard everybody can see. So think about it right now. You're a Michigan football player, for instance. It's late January. It's early February. There's no games right now. How do you know, as one out of 120 players on a team, how do you know if you're rising or falling? You have to have that internal scoreboard. Winning teams are full of people who've mastered theirs. They know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly why. This week, thank God, confirmation came on high on both the internal and external scoreboard. Tuesday morning, I wake up to good news. The Allen Media Group, which was going to fire local meteorologists across the country, they were going to fire the weatherman and instead run the Weather Channel feed. Well, it turns out they've listened to reason. They listen to the voice of the people, and they will make weather local again, just as we asked. Don't ever discount the power of your voice. Because you spoke up, a global media company listened to reason. Our weathermen will keep their jobs, and our local news will retain its local character. This is a win for everybody, and it's affirmation and confirmation of the power of your voice. Use it. When I was 17, I found a book that changed my life. It's called Stand Up, Speak Out, Talk Back. Believe it or not, at that point in life, I needed help speaking my voice. Turns out that the friends I had in middle school weren't really my friends. And then, as a sophomore in high school, I moved to a different school. And so by the summer between my junior and senior year, I was done deferring. I was done watching and waiting and listening. It was time to speak up. And the lesson in the book came at the exact perfect time. 9/11 happened just a few months later. And what followed was a 25-year assault on American freedom and citizenship. With a supposed conservative running the country in George W. Bush, America decided to let the terrorists win. And so right as my balls were dropping, those of my countrymen were shrinking. Everybody was afraid. For some people, this fear transformed into anger, but of an impotent sort. America lost its smile, and we became too demoralized to even imagine a better future. We became so desperate that Barack Obama seemed like a breath of fresh air. Under Bush, we asked for retribution on our attackers. What we got instead was 2 20-year wars that we didn't win. We asked Bush to run the country with honor, unlike Bill Clinton. Then he nominated his golfing buddy, Harriet Miers, to the U.S. Supreme Court. Under Bush, America was a clown show. Since reading this book, I've sent it to dozens of friends. I can't send a copy to everybody who listens, but I can tell you this much. Stand up, speak out, talk back. It's the only way we'll save Michigan. And so a second piece of confirmation came later on Tuesday. A leftist Twitter account who I will not name because I can help you a lot more than you can hurt me, and I'm not going to do that. They wrote an entire thread about me. The first tweet was just marvelous. Like, if any of you guys have connections at the DIA, let's see if we can get this hung up on the wall at the DIA because it's art. It says, meet James David Dixon, former reporter for the Detroit News, misogynist, homophobe, election denier, partisan hack, and fascist fanboy with a foot fetish. Look, I was happy that the Allen Media Group kept the weatherman. I was thrilled, though, to be attacked in such desperate and deranged terms. That means we're getting somewhere, guys. After 6 months, we're getting somewhere. We're on the radar of these people. In Acts 5, the apostles dared to preach the name of Jesus. And so the Sanhedrin, the same body that brought up Jesus on charges that got him crucified, arrested the apostles, and they flogged them rather than kill them. Apostles 5:41 tells us that as the apostles left the Sanhedrin, they were rejoicing because they'd been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. If the Bible's too heavy for you, let's try Bruce Springsteen. Can't start a fire worrying about your little world falling apart. If we're going to save our state, it's going to take many more days like yesterday. There's going to be many more attacks like this one. And I thank God to be counted worthy of the enemy's energies and attacks. When you put on that full armor of God, when you stand on the solid rock, the attacks of the enemy are a welcome sight. And so while some leftist is out there trying to set the Guinness World Record for most adjectives in a single tweet, you know what they weren't doing? Shouting their abortions, selling kids on queer theory, burning down cities. What I'm asking now is for you to join me. What can you do to confuse and demoralize and distract the enemy? Remember, we're not up against men. Men could never get our attention. We're up against the spirit of Satan. We're up against the spirit of Satan, which means that winning is the only possible option. You've seen what happens when Democrats run the place. They do what the devil does. They steal, kill, and destroy. These are the people who've made the murder of their own offspring somehow the most important issue in politics. And so the more they promote my name or your name, the more people will be led down the path of sanity. There's plenty of room here on the solid rock for anyone who wants to join us. What can you do? What more can I do to be counted worthy of these attacks? Let's find out. The Bible tells us to fear God and be of good courage toward man. So if you're worried about what people might say, or, oh my God, my kids are going to see it, my wife's going to see it, you have nothing to fear in mean tweets. Trust me. Our attackers are standing in sinking sand. Don't be alarmed when they lash out. That's just the anger of the drowning man. My guest today is Victoria Snitsar Churchill. Victoria was a colleague of mine on the New York Post swing state team. She's also a contributor to the Young Voices Network and has her own blog and podcast called Freedom Shots. I say make news local again all the time, but the swing state team actually did it. Our boss, Kelly Jane Torrance, had a brilliant idea how to cover the 7 swing states. Most times, the Post might send out its own reporters to those states, and they would arrive in those places with no sources, and they would write coverage rather than break news. And so Torrance took a different approach. Her thesis was, if I can hire local reporters, they'll break news, not just cover what was said. They'll tell the stories that the Democrat media won't tell. And in the end, she was right. Donald Trump swept all 7 swing states. Victoria had a unique experience on the team, though. I was one of 2 people covering Michigan. Okay, so that's 10 million people. We got two people covering it. Me and a guy, George Caldwell, who's now in D.C. Victoria somehow covered 3 states: Virginia, where she lives, along with Pennsylvania and North Carolina. We're going to figure out exactly how that was able to happen. Victoria, welcome to the Enjoyer podcast.
Thank you so much, James. So great to be here with you today. And yeah, it was a wild time on Team Swing State. For Pennsylvania, I ended up being one of 3 reporters. So they actually ended up doing most of the coverage towards the end. But yeah, North Carolina and Virginia were ones that I was in charge of. So yeah, it was a pretty wild ride, but I'm glad I did it. And kind of as you pointed out, I think we were able to cover some stories that very few, if no other media outlets did. And that's, I think, something that was really special, especially in today's day and age when I think you look on any of the major news sites and they just regurgitate the same headlines over and over, and we were doing
Same
something
stories.
different.
Same stories. And, something I found is that, so when we would have scoops, so we had stories, Alyssa Slotkin doesn't pay property taxes. She's a fake farmer. She lied to a group of farmers in their face. She broke up a 25-year military marriage. First time she voted in Michigan was in 2018 for herself. When we broke these stories, this was all information people didn't know or hadn't thought of. The flagship papers in Michigan would not follow those reports. Did you find that when you had a new nugget, did the locals even follow it up?
Not too much. I think some of the very interesting things that we saw, particularly in one race that I covered just in my own backyard, Virginia's 7th congressional district, that's one that's been in the national news,
Was
I
that the
think, for at
Vindman
least the
race?
last 3 cycles. Yeah, that was Vindman versus Derek Anderson.
Yes.
So, unfortunately, at least in my view, Vindman is currently the congressman here, but I think we did enough to try and, throw a few arrows at him. But I think the thing that made them more powerful was the truth, because that's what it was. There was some other outlets that actually first reported some very shady business between Vindman and his brother. There kind of always been this kind of pair floating around DC, both in the
Right.
first Trump administration, and then they both kind of made household names of themselves being these anti-Trump resistors.
Yeah,
And,
the
one of
resistance.
them, Eugene, is currently a congressman representing Virginians. But there was a lot of questions that went unanswered. Some of them, like about Vindman's military record, Eugene's military record, were asked by local media. But, the other thing that was really interesting is that he really did not want to talk to a lot of media, not even the locals, because, for example, I think it was like a week or so before the election when he did sit down for an interview, he even made a mistake on what district he was running in.
So he basically ran a basement Biden campaign,
Yeah,
probably
exactly.
banking on the fact that a good amount of my coverage will be favorable because I'm the Democrat and I'm this figure of the resistance.
Yeah, pretty much. And, unfortunately in Northern Virginia, that seemed to work despite what we saw happen a lot of other places across the country. So it was quite interesting that, especially in 2024, that it worked for him. But yeah, we'll see if Virginia keeps him in office, less than 2 years from now, whether he can keep it going. I think he's already done some things that have upset some people. So, we're keeping tabs.
Absolutely. Now, Victoria, I understand you have some travel to Michigan lined up this year.
I would
What can
like
you tell
to,
me about
yes.
that? What can you tell me about your
Well, it's
plans?
not totally confirmed yet, but I know you guys are home to the Great Acton Institute, so they've got some great programming coming on in the summer.
Yeah.
I actually had it on my radar last summer, which was right around the time that I was starting the post job, so it didn't
Mm-hmm.
quite line up. Obviously, I think I made the better decision there.
Yeah.
But obviously, I knew that conference was going to be happening, and so I think they actually just announced Arthur Brooks, who used to be actually out here in D.C., president of American Enterprise Institute.
Yeah.
He's a great thought leader, so he'll be there at the Acton Institute conference, so that'll be very fun. And outside of that, I was like, well, if I'm going to be there, I might as well see some sights. So we'll see what that looks like. But yeah, stay tuned.
Absolutely. What of what you know about Michigan? What do you enjoy about Michigan? If you feel the need to mention me, we don't usually accept that as an answer, but in your case, I'll make an exception.
Well, it's because of you and because of this podcast, I actually found out about Iron Pig barbecue. And, as I mentioned
Yes.
in the intro, I covered North Carolina. So I ate a lot of good barbecue. Last year when I was on the campaign trail, I was constantly, in our group that we had of all of us, I was constantly sending pictures about all the great food I got to eat, particularly in North Carolina. But yeah, I'm excited to check out Iron Pig. That's actually kind of one of the reasons I want to extend my stay and beyond just going to that conference is so that I can go to Iron Pig, believe it or not. So I'm
Really?
quite a big foodie. Yeah.
Really? Is
Yeah.
it the barbecue aspect? Is it the story? Is it both?
Well, it's both. I mean, I'm a journalist and I love good story, but also as a journalist that's gotten to travel quite a bit, I love good food. And so I think to me those two things actually are, you can't really take one without the other. They have to be there together and to me that's what makes that so appealing.
What can you tell us about North Carolina barbecue? Like, what makes it unique to North Carolina?
Well, it's the sauce, right? So it's like the vinegary sauce versus,
Hmm.
Kansas City is more of like a wetter. So I also went to college in Kansas, so I got to appreciate and,
Oh,
to take the
gosh.
word out of your mouth, enjoy
Yes.
some great barbecue when I was going to school in Kansas. So yeah, I've had a chance to eat a lot of good barbecue in my life, and Iron Pig is next on my list.
Okay, you have a unique perch. Kansas City barbecue, North Carolina barbecue.
And up next, Michigan barbecue.
No, I'm saying which one's better?
Oh, which one's better? Man,
Which one's
they
better?
are just different. Like everybody always says that they're different, but I really think they are. I think Kansas City is more into the meats versus like into the beef barbecue versus North Carolina. I mean, when I think of it, it's like the classic pulled pork sandwich with the vinegar sauce.
Hmm. Yeah, now I'm hungry. Um, so on the swing state team, I mentioned this in the monologue. We actually helped make news local again. We ran really a pilot for the idea. Help people understand because people don't know the inner workings of this stuff. They just see New York Post and think that you're. I'll call someone from a 313 number, and if they didn't know me, from my Detroit news run or something like that, they would still assume that I'm in New York because
Yep.
why wouldn't you? Help people understand how an East Coast publication would have normally covered the presidential race versus the unique way we did it.
Well, so this is what I saw because when I was doing all the travel that I was doing between those three states, I did see a lot of other publications based out of DC, whether that was, ABC, NBC, CNN, just about any other publication that you can think of, as well as, the ones that we have just here in DC, places like the Washington Post and things like that. They were in these press pens at these events like I was. I think between Trump and Vance events, I went to about 24 of these
Right.
rallies and hoorah things that we had all over the campaign trail. But that's how a lot of these folks operated, is that they would fly in and out just for one event, maybe two if they got lucky. And, that was its own thing. I don't know how much you guys had it in Michigan, but out here, the Harris campaign, they were so horrible about even letting reporters know when the events were. And I thought that was just because they didn't like us. But even, I actually will give a little bit of credit to the mainstream, the legacy media on this. I don't think they did it too much publicly, but at least behind the scenes, they were actually kind of complaining about Kamala Harris, which I found a little bit surprising that they would
Really?
even do that. But yeah, especially
What
with
were
the
they
Harris
saying?
team. Well, like just saying like her team was very inaccessible, and that's the experience that I had. But again, I was kind of making sure that it wasn't just because of who
It was
we
the
were
same story.
representing.
It was the same deal in Michigan where that was a common complaint where, you're talking all this Democrat rhetoric, but you're not doing the Democrat thing, which is like by getting with the people and listening to them. And like Democrats have certain expectations of people. And yeah, they still voted for Harris, but there was not that excitement because a lot of people didn't feel like they knew who she was.
Yeah, and particularly in North Carolina, they had the former governor, Roy Cooper. He was kind of the key Harris in-state surrogate. He would precede her at all of the events,
Hmm.
which I thought was really interesting. I mean, obviously, Trump would have the local elected at his events as
Right.
well, but there it was very clearly like, this is the pre-show and he's the main event. But with Harris, it kind of seemed like she was like the encore. Like, all of the local guys were getting
Right.
people riled up. Whether that was Cooper, whether that was some congressmen, Jeff Jackson, actually a former congressman, now the attorney general. he beat Dan Bishop, who's a Republican who was up for that seat. But like I said, a lot of these guys, they were the warm up act, but it kind of seemed like they were most of the program, and Harris was kind of the afterthought. Like, people came here for her, and they didn't really even get to hear much from her more than maybe 20, 30 minutes at a time, versus Trump's going hour and a half, 2 hours. And then even at the end of the campaign, he was doing 2 or 3 events a day, which was totally crazy.
Absolutely.
And
his
even
energy
with
as
that,
a 78-year-old man, like I heard an excerpt, just an excerpt. I didn't, I'm not going to sit up here and listen to a 4-hour podcast. I heard an excerpt of Trump on Rogan, and I needed a nap. This guy recorded 3 hours, didn't even take a piss while he was there, gets back in his thing, heads up to Michigan and does rallies. Like, how does a guy who's 80 have that kind of energy?
I don't know, honestly, it beats me. Like, and I mean, honestly, kudos to the staff, to these guys too, because I know I got to travel with Vance a couple of days, and his press wrangler, his press coordinator, she was always looking so prim and polished, and she was showing up to things 15 minutes earlier than I was, and I was like, I just got three hours of sleep. I don't know how you're doing it, girl. Like, your hair is just so perfectly curled. Yeah, she did a great job, and like I said, she had the tough job of wrangling us as the press, all of us crazy kids trying to do our own thing. So yeah, shout out to them, and yeah, everybody that keeps up with these guys. Like, I think they do a really good job.
Across the swing states, Trump won all of them, but in Michigan, the Senate candidate, Mike Rogers, comes up about 20,000 votes short. And there were several cases like this, especially in the Senate race. What do you make of this? On Twitter, everyone wants to think that everything was stolen every time. I don't think it makes sense exactly to steal just the Senate race, but not the whole election. What do you make of these cases where someone was not able to slide across on Trump's coattails?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you bring up the idea of the coattails. It's a known thing in the political world, and obviously Trump himself holds such a big name. And, he did his best, I think, during all these rallies that we went to, saying, hey, so-and-so, come on up, like, introduce yourself to the crowd. But I don't know how much that stuck just with the people that were there just for Trump.
Right.
I know even going back to the 2016 race and the 2020 race, there was a lot of people, obviously, that had never voted or hadn't voted in 20 years that voted for Trump. And so I don't know if that enthusiasm necessarily carried down down the ballot. But yeah, it's interesting because, like, in that case with the Virginia 7th District race, we were hoping the Trump wave would kind of pull over, Derek Anderson over the threshold and potentially even Hung Cao, even though he was trailing more than Derek. Derek was kind of looking neck and neck really for the whole race. They wanted to make sure that race didn't get called until they actually counted all the ballots. So it actually took a couple days for that race here in Virginia 7 to be called. But yeah, it's interesting because in Virginia, I think there was this feeling that if there was a year for Republicans to do good again,
right?
Obviously, we had kind of the Youngkin model from 2021, which was the backlash to the Biden election. But there was a lot of hope because I actually had my friend Jesse Blakely on my show, on the Freedom Shot show. She was on because we actually had some special elections in Virginia because we had a couple members of the state legislature elected to Congress, so that triggered some open seats. I asked her, like, and she's somebody that's been active in Republican politics. Her full-time job right now is with 501c4, but on her personal time, she's been active. She is a former Young Republican state chair as well, actually, during that Youngkin run in 2021. And I'm like, where do Republicans in Virginia go from here? Because there is so much energy. And then, really, we came up short what looked like in pretty small margins in 2022. And in 2023, the state legislature was decided by just a couple thousand votes, across maybe 2 or 3 seats as well. And so this Youngkin agenda on the state level was definitely stunted a little bit from what it potentially could have been. And then, there's a lot of energy for both the 10th district and the 7th district again in 2022, and they came up short. And, this is one of those races, of course, it being just outside of the DC Beltway, there's a lot of eyes on it naturally.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of a question, I think, kind of similar to what you guys are asking in Michigan is what we're asking in Virginia is how do we get back to it and how do we get so much enthusiasm out again?
Especially with Trump not physically on the ballot himself. I mean, if his coattails weren't long enough for Mike Rogers when he's on the ballot, and Trump himself just got shot in the head, will Trump merely saying, vote for that guy, but not for me because you can't vote for me? Is that really going to hold that power? Like, I think two things need to happen at once. One, Republicans need to build the future, the MAGA 2.0, MAGA after Trump. But Republicans can't count on that happening. You have to act like there's no such thing as Donald Trump, and basically you have to be able to win anyway in 2026. Without the man on the ballot, 2018 was a bad year in Michigan for Republicans. 2022 was another bad year. And I just fear that it could be the same thing. Do you see a post-Trump approach forming?
Well, I think right now, it's going to be whoever aligns with the Trump agenda and what steps they can take to either help that or hinder that. I think looking especially in the Senate, I know you guys just come up with the open Senate seat this year, or, just this week in Michigan with Gary Peters saying he's not going to run again. But there's a few key races for people that are already, the Republicans that are already in seats. 2026 is going to be really interesting because they would have won 6 years ago, which was 2020. And so they won even though Trump lost. And so there's going to be, people like your Susan Collins. I think Murkowski was up in 2022, so she won't be up again in 2026. But we're also looking even in states like Texas, John Cornyn. He's one that I'm watching pretty closely right now because on Second Amendment stuff, he was actually part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, as they called it in the Democrats, the big anti-gun bill. But now he's actually trying to push constitutional carry reciprocity. So it's quite interesting because he's kind of trying to play both sides because he knows that he has a race like that coming up. And then again, there's other people like Bill Cassidy in Louisiana. There's Tom Tillis in North Carolina. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see because again, I think a lot of these people feel like they don't really have to toe the Trump line because they won their seats last time around despite him. So it's going to be very interesting to see to what extent they work with his agenda and to what extent they try to say, yeah, maybe I have an R to my name just like he does, but I'm different and here's how. And if that's going to help or hinder them.
Right. Absolutely. So you live in Virginia, D.C. area, Virginia, in the early part of this country's history. Virginia was the birthplace of presidents, right around when it became the capital. And then we saw Ohio kind of overtake that mantle. And now it's been a really long time so Virginia is like this former presidential blue blood that's become a lot like Michigan, where the only one we ever had from Michigan was Gerald Ford, a man who was never elected president. He had someone else had to resign for him to get it. What's your read on why your state doesn't produce presidents anymore?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know.
As you think about it, I'll give my read on Michigan. So I think the reason people like Michigan or people from Michigan rarely rise up is because, as we've seen with Gretchen Whitmer, you can go far being a clown in Michigan. Our politics are kind of on amateur settings. And so there's a lot of, like, she produced that video where she was a talking potato last year. She pretty much ran the Barbie thing into the ground. You don't have to be serious to win a term in Michigan. And if you win one term, you're going to win 2 terms. And so I think the low bar, I think the Democrat favoring media that they come through in Lansing leaves you kind of uniquely unsuited because you haven't faced any fire yet. I think about what happened to Tim Walz just now. This guy comes out from Minnesota. They act like he's the best thing ever. Turns out he's a clown, and the media had been covering for him the entire time. And so only on the national stage do you hear from the dissident voices and you see it with your own eyes. Wait a minute. This guy's a clown and probably always has been. It was too late. And I fear that something like that would happen with Whitmer. So Michigan raises clowns, not presidents. What's going on in Virginia?
We have had powerful people come from Virginia. Obviously we had, for the Democrats, we had Tim Kaine, who was Hillary Clinton's running mate. It's interesting because he himself is actually from Minnesota, like Tim Walz was.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
When I see it now, I see that same squirrely vibe now that you say that. That's actually pretty disturbing.
Yeah, that's actually something that came out of an interview that I had with Hung Kao, who was our Senate candidate here last cycle. He's like, I'm running against two terrible Tims from Minnesota. I was like, wow, I did not even realize just fresh off the bat that Tim Kaine was from Minnesota. And obviously, Tim Kaine was up again for his Senate seat this year,
Mm-hmm.
who Hung Kao was running against.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's interesting. I think in Virginia, we have some high turnover in our more critical congressional seats. People only are in for a term or two. And we've seen that both between Democrats and Republicans. And a lot of those seats are, more suburban, either Northern Virginia or even down in the Virginia Beach area. There's a lot of turnover in those seats. And I think to kind of get that capital for a presidential run,
Right.
you really need to be entrenched for a while.
There's no incubation, it sounds like.
Yeah. And again, in cases like J.D. Vance, that's not quite the case. But even then, he's been on a national stage for, I think, at least close to a decade, with his book and obviously being a little bit more anti-Trump in the beginning and things like that. And so at least through that, he's been more of a known entity nationally, which I think definitely helped him. Obviously, he had said some things that he kind of had to pull back during the campaign and even since about Trump because people still ask him about it. But for the most part, he's been in the public eye in some shape or form. His family, his wife. I've even seen interviews that they did together back when that book first came out, which I thought was really interesting. But then, we've also had for people that do serve in office longer, both on the Democrat and the Republican side, I think they become a little bit more entrenched because they have to kind of play to their base, which in those districts that are less volatile is more liberal or more conservative. And so then when you think about a national presidential run, for the most part, you think about somebody who can be palatable for the whole country and also cross party lines. I think that's why, even we saw people like Chris Christie, for example, running, right, back in 2016. And so with that, I think it's kind of this dichotomy of like you want experience, but the people that get experience have to be more I don't want to say radical, but kind of more further to the beliefs of one side or the other. And again, I think that's true of both parties.
Absolutely. I do a lot of media criticism on the show, and I have problems with the work of journalism, but also with the field. I think reporters tend to be underpaid. I think there's often a lack of training opportunities because if you're at a newspaper, you think they want you to become twice as good a reporter as you are and leave? No, they want you to stay exactly where you are underpaid. How'd you come to be a journalist, and why do you believe that this is something that can be done well?
Well, my first foray into journalism was actually back in high school. I worked for my local town paper. They had opportunities for students to write. So that was like my first published article. I
Yes.
was in my local newspaper. And again, kind of going back to your point, local journalism being so underfunded, both what I saw in high school and even in college is that actually both for the local newspaper and for even like a local TV station that we had in college, about half their work was done by students because they could do it unpaid or for very, very measly pennies that a student loves to have that kind of money, but no professional would even take that money. And so I think there's kind of this dichotomy of like, you get more training and more opportunities and more responsibility very early on. And then you get put into a bigger market or a bigger paper. And you're really kind of, I think, pigeonholed in a lot of these traditional mediums that people publish and then kind of expand their careers. But yeah, it's interesting. So kind of after that, I actually was editor-in-chief of a national paper in high school run by students for students.
Really?
So yeah, it's
a
called
national paper?
Yeah. So Junior State of America, it's a political activism organization. It's nonpartisan, nonprofit. And so they have people kind of from all sides. But so I ran a staff of like, I think it was like 12 or 14 people from all around the country. Yeah. That was my first foray. So Junior State of America, we had a publication. It was called JSA Today. And yeah, I was editor-in-chief of that. That was kind of my first foray, I think, into direct political journalism. Was, I was writing articles and columns at the time about Obama and, some of his bad policies. So it was kind of at that point I knew I wasn't necessarily going to be in the vast left wing media. But I grew up primarily on the West Coast in the Seattle area, and then in California, and then I went to college in Kansas so I was also an athlete, so I wanted somewhere that had a decent journalism school, but that I could also get an athletic scholarship. So that's
What
how I ended up
sport?
at KU. It's like a top 15, top 20 program, or at least was
Yeah.
back then. So they're not UNC journalism school or even Mizzou that's right next door. They're not a top 10, but they'll
Right.
still give you a decent education. And
What
then
what
kind of
sport did you play?
I was a rower.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
in the boats. Yeah. And yes,
Okay.
Kansas has water. That's kind of the next follow-up question that people
Yeah,
always
I was gonna pull up a map actually and say, could you show me on the map where the water is?
Yes,
Wow.
in Lawrence there's a river, the the Kansas River. So yes, there's a river. And K-State actually rows on that same river too. So it's enough to support at least 2 rowing teams. But kind of the other interesting question is when I was in California, when I was a high school rower, we actually rowed on a reservoir. And so kind of even all this recent news about all the
Right.
fires and stuff, I remember because rowing races is kind of 2 standard lengths that you have. You have a sprint race, which is 2,000 meters, and then you have what's called a head race, which is 5,000 meters. And so I remember in California on the reservoir, obviously because the reservoir expands in length, the more water that there is, it rises higher, right? And so if you can think about it, to do the full race and to practice, it was actually a different amount of laps each time that you would show up to practice. And so in rowing, there's somebody called the coxswain
Yeah.
that sits and does all the commands and stuff. And so the coxswain would have to be very, very pertinent to what was going on in the situation to know, like, are we doing 1.25 laps of the reservoir today? At what point do we need to turn the boat around to like do the full meters? So that's my little stint on California and water management that I didn't even realize was a thing really kind of beyond that. But like thinking back, I'm like, wow, this has been a problem for like at least a decade, because every week you'd show up to rowing practice and you'd have to row the reservoir a different amount of times.
Victoria, how did you spend your pandemic?
So I was in Iowa. I was actually working as a staffer on Trump's campaign. So that's how I spent my pandemic. It was quite interesting, just working on the grassroots level. So this is kind of to your further point, is that I actually went and I worked for campaigns because I thought it was a better path being more kind of on the PR and the comms route out of journalism school versus actually being a journalist. And then, I kind of realized that it's an interesting career path. So I actually worked. So Trump was my last campaign that I worked on. I worked on 3 congressional campaigns before that in Kansas, where I went to school. So I went and I worked for a former member from Kansas, Lynn Jenkins. She's amazing. She used to be vice chair of the House Republican Conference here in D.C. And then she retired. So I worked for the guy that replaced her, Steve Watkins. He ended up being a 1-term member. That's another interesting story for another interesting time. But I never worked for him in D.C. I only worked for him on the campaign trail. So then actually I ended up in DC. I interned at Leadership Institute, which I don't know how familiar you and your viewers are. They're a great organization here in DC. They train conservatives, libertarians. I mean, they're nonpartisan, so they'll train whoever, but that's typically who tends to attend their programs is more conservative, libertarian, free-thinking types. So I actually interned there at Campus Reform, which is their publication that covers liberal bias on college campuses. And then I needed a job after that. And so through LI, I got connected with the Trump campaign, and having gone to school in the Midwest in Kansas, Iowa was kind of a natural fit. And, just in terms of political lore, working in Iowa in a presidential year
Oh yeah,
is
huge.
something that everybody wants to do. I think whether you're a journalist or a staffer. So I kind of knew that was my opportunity to do that in my life. And I'm glad I did it. It was an interesting time, and it ended up being a lot more interesting because of the pandemic. We basically had to flip our operation on its head in the span of a couple weeks. And, in terms of Iowa, Trump actually won Iowa by 10 points. So I'm glad to have been a part of that. But yeah, after that, I decided that, so I know I didn't really necessarily want to do campaigns anymore after that. And, part of that was seeing like I had control over a lot of things that I was able to do in my locality that I was in charge of. The first 10 months I was there, I was a field staffer. And then 4 months after that, I the last 4 months of the campaign, I ended up being the strategic initiatives director. So I was actually in charge of setting up a lot of what are called like the surrogate events. So actually a lot of the kinds of events that I ended up covering on the campaign this year.
Right.
4 years ago, I was in charge of putting them on. And, I realized that I like to show up as a member of the press a lot more than I like planning all of that. But so after that, I went to work for a grassroots organization that did 501c3 and 501c4 activism here in Virginia. Actually, one of the things we focused on was election integrity kind of after the 2020 campaign, because in Virginia, we were able to kind of implement that like the next year because we had elections.
Right.
So we were able to do that and work for a couple of local candidates, trying to get them over the line. And then, kind of after that, so I started freelance writing again when I was doing that, because when I was working on the campaign, obviously I couldn't do any of that. And then I had my opportunity to join the publication where I spent 2.5 years. It's called American Liberty News. And then they also had a Virginia publication, which was the Republican Standard, which is kind of how I got back into campaign reporting. And that's how I ended up at the Post. So I think I bring a very unique flavor to my writing, having been a staffer. But the way that I always see it is like, I know where to look for things. And so, when you were a staffer doing opposition research and, you learn how to look at financial disclosures and things like that, those are all skills that I feel like I was able to transfer very well in this job.
Absolutely. Now in Michigan, there's some talk about a constitutional carry ballot initiative. So right now you have to have a CPL, and if you don't, you can basically go down for 2 years, felony firearm. And they're even harsh with first-time offenders, someone whose CPL lapsed yesterday. I mean, it's pretty extreme in Michigan. From what you were telling me off air, there's efforts afoot in Washington that would make our ballot measure unnecessary. It might already be fixed by then. What's going on with universal constitutional carry?
Yeah, so there's 29 states, I believe, as of today, that have constitutional carry or concealed carry. People can just carry in the state without a concealed permit. And then there's also reciprocity that already exists in a lot of states where you go and you get the permit. So in the states that have constitutional carry, you can still get a permit. You just don't need it to carry. And where that permit, becomes useful is that across all these states, it's like a driver's license, right? You don't need to go and get a new driver's license in every single state.
Full faith and credit, right?
Exactly. And so with firearms permits, it doesn't work that way. And, particularly where I live in the greater Washington, D.C. region, it's really interesting because you think about, crossing state lines. Like in D.C., you can do that 3 or 4 times in the course of a day. There's people that live in West Virginia and commute into D.C. for work every day. So, it being from West Virginia, you can drive from West Virginia to Maryland to Virginia to Washington, D.C. And so there you go. You've crossed state lines 3 times and 3 times on your way back home. And so in this area, it becomes quite interesting because Virginia recognizes a D.C. permit, but I don't believe D.C. recognizes a Virginia permit. And then so most people, at least that I know that, live in Virginia and then go into D.C., they have both. But the DC permit takes a lot more time to get because DC Police Department takes a lot of time to do that, which again is ridiculous because as a lot of Second Amendment activists and people in that space would argue is, why do I even have to have a permit anyways? Because it's my constitutional right.
Yeah, my permit is the Second Amendment, people say, which is nice, but there's a lot of people in prison who'd say the same thing.
Exactly. So that's the point. And so particularly even with Maryland, it's gotten a little bit easier, I believe, from people that I've heard of that have gone through the Maryland process. I personally haven't. But, in Maryland, basically the only way that you could get a permit to carry concealed was to be like a special investigator. So like as a layperson, you couldn't really do that, which I think is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of crime that goes on in Maryland, particularly in D.C., kind of between D.C. and Baltimore area. So if there's any region to need it, it's in that region. And so there's a lot of states that basically will only let you carry if you have a permit from that state. Now, again, they're getting fewer and fewer, but what this national bill would do, it would mean that your permit would have to be recognized in any other state.
So we would still need the amendment in Michigan because, to get around the need for a permit, you'd still need constitutional carry in Michigan. But this reciprocity, that could add an element to it. But so yeah, we would still have the need in Michigan. So guys, we are not off the hook. No one has done the work for you. No one could do the work for you. These things are handled at the state level. So get serious about the state level work. Uh, Victoria, we'll get you out of here on this one. Tell us about Freedom Shots. And you're a young woman still in the first decade of your adult life. What should a high school age, what should a college age journalist be doing right now? Prospective journalists, how should they be spending their time right now?
Yeah, so Freedom Shots is my own project that I launched. So it's a newsletter on Substack and a podcast as well. So I'm just in the beginning stages of it. I literally started it, I guess it was right before the new year, but I'm kind of taking it seriously with the new year. So we're just a few episodes in.
Yeah.
And for me, I wanted that space because I found that as a print reporter, there's so many great conversations that I have. And then when you have to put them in a story, you have to pull like 2 lines of it, right? And then I'll go and I'll talk to somebody for 30 or 45 minutes. They tell me all these amazing things. And as somebody that also does interviews, just like I'm on right now, I think everything that I say is important and I say it for a reason. And, I say things the way that I say them for a reason. And so I think kind of having that understanding, I kind of feel bad like every single time I interview somebody for a print story and I can't run everything that they say. And, even again, like even when we were covering Trump rallies, everything that he says is for a reason.
Right.
He might be the only person that knows that reason, but like there's a way that he does things and he says things to connect with the audience that he connects with. And, like I said, even on the campaign trail, I was like, how are all of these news outlets out of an hour and a half or 2 hour long speech pulling out the exact same line? Like,
because again, they came with the stories pre-written.
Exactly.
I mean, there was a guy who was covering the RFK hearing yesterday, Callie Means, I believe, on X, who he kind of got behind press row and showed these people came in with headlines written, with stories thick with copy. So in no sense were they actually covering what happened yesterday. At best, they had a narrative that they were going to be faithful to, and maybe they'd crane in a quote or two.
Yeah, I mean, and, pre-writing is no shock to anybody that is in the journalism industry. And a lot of the time, there's a lot of information that you backfill kind of before the event. And so that's not new. But what I'm saying...
It can even be copied from previous stories.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, again, that's common across the board. But yeah, the fact that they had headlines pre-written, I think that to me was pretty shocking because they knew exactly what they wanted to pull. They wanted to wait kind of for a gotcha moment, I think, is the way that a lot of these folks approach their job to, get clicks and make money. And that's how they operate. And so, yeah, on my show, I wanted to have actually really a place for, I'll have some people that work in politics, but actually for other journalists, because I think it's interesting that so many times we're supposed to be in competition with one another, and I like recognizing what other people do. And so, my guest that I just had on my show, he's also from Young Voices. He does that. So for Young Voices, it's not like a full-time job for any of us, but we do publishing through them and media interviews. And so, a lot of the times, like, you can't even really link back to stories that other people do. And so I have so many people in my network that are kind of subject matter experts on these very niche things, and I want to have these conversations with people that I would never really even be able to interview them for a story. And so that was kind of the creation of that space. So
you created a platform where you could have these conversations.
Exactly.
And it wouldn't be a waste of anyone's time of like, hey, when's that story gonna run? That kind of thing. People hate that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so, with here, I have full control over what goes out and when, and, basically, unless somebody asks me to make a cut or they make a mistake or whatever, it runs pretty much as it is. So yeah, I think that's exciting. And I think that's something that people want. What we saw from the campaign trail was, again, like on shows like Rogan and, Theo Vaughn and Sean Ryan's show, people want these deep, authentic conversations, and they don't necessarily want headlines. And so I think you have to have a little bit of both, but I think it really brings a more authentic air to journalism. And so I think kind of going into your final question of what should high school or college students be looking for and doing, I would suggest, getting your name out there. I think there is a lot less risk involved when you're 18 or 19. But I'd
People
say,
still want to
make
help
it.
you at those young ages.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of resources out there. There's some fellowships that I've participated in that have definitely helped me along my way. And actually, kind of to your earlier point about, when you're actually in a newsroom, they just want you to drive copy. They don't want you to grow and develop. There's a
No.
fellowship that I'm in right now called Media Accelerator Fellowship through the Fund for American Studies, TFAS. And I've mentored actually some of their college students, but they
Yeah.
created this fellowship just for people in the first 10 years of their career, just like I am, because they
Right.
recognize that in these day-to-day newsrooms, you don't really have a chance to focus on you. And so I think the creation of this fellowship is so powerful because it has let all of us a space to do just that. But yeah, so again, for the final point of advice, I would say, get out there, network. I think your network is so important, and build good connections, because there's people that I'm reaching out to that I've known, or at least kind of had on my radar for 8 to 10 years, because you
Right.
never know when that connection could come in handy. So, and kind of when I mentor, particularly through TFAS, I always advise folks, in my personal experience, I've actually never gotten a job just by applying.
No.
Just through like a random, portal or whatever. And so when I hear people, I want to go to GC, I want to get a job, I'm applying to 30 things a day. And it's like, I mean, I've done that before too in job searches, and it feels good because it feels like you're moving the needle.
Feels like
but
activity. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's not really goal driven. And so for me, every single job that I've actually gotten has been somehow connected in my network that I already have. So build that network and build it early and go to as many things as you can. There's a lot of conferences, particularly in the conservative, libertarian, right of center space, that will fly you out and give you opportunities to meet all these people. And that's something that I did all throughout my college career. Actually,
It's so
speaking of
important.
Leadership Institute, I just had a notification pop up on my personal Facebook from a LI conference that I went to 7 years ago. And I'm like, I could still pick out half of those people that I'm at least tangentially still connected with. So literally these connections that you build, you don't build them necessarily for the idea that you're going to go ask them for a job or for a quote in a future job if you want to be a journalist. But these connections will pay dividends throughout the rest of your life more than you could ever imagine.
That's the thing. Today's person you're quoting, maybe the person you're hiring, maybe the person you're helping get a job. People need to help people. Victoria, where can people find more about yourself? Where can people find Freedom Shots?
Yeah, so Freedom Shots is on Substack, is kind of how we publish, but then we're also on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And yeah, that's shout out to Substack. If anybody's not familiar with it, you can just upload all your stuff and they handle all the distribution. So that's why I went with the platform, because it's pretty foolproof, which, I kind of need that really at this point, like just idiot proof. But outside of that, I am on X at Snits_Churchy. That's SNITS_CHURCHY. Or on Instagram at Victoria Snitsar Churchill. That's my full name. And then if you type that in, that should come up with however else you want to get in contact with me. That's my website. It's victoriasnitsarchurchill.com. LinkedIn, Facebook, my public Facebook page, all of that is out there. So yeah, connect with me and see all the latest things that I'm doing.
Awesome. Will do. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me, James. It was great.